super exciting. I want to thank everyone for coming out, especially Occupy Columbia. Alliances are awesome. And yeah, at the risk of sounding totally formal, I'm going to do a little introduction here. It's inherently weird to introduce a collective whose identity has so successfully been kept low-key, and I realize that no summary or explanation could come close to the gravitas of Crimethinc's rebel mythology. Because it's that very decentralized commitment that has allowed Crimethinc to infiltrate not only anarchist and radical current discourse, but the social totality of the mainstream that we're rapidly experiencing in the 21st century. But since the mid-1990s, Crimethinc has been an active witness to the cycles of crisis and the cycles of resistance implemented by the capitalist and neoliberal state of first world exploitation. From its beginnings with the publishing of the hardcore punk scene Inside Fronts and the organic circulation of their dropout lifestyle manual, Evasion, Crimethinc has strayed from the harnessed ideological pull of first world comfort and complacency, immersing the self and the collective into secret worlds where subverting control and escaping constraints are accessible rather than being fixed theory, and where revolution is understood not as a moment, but as a total life process. Among their best-known publications are Days of War, Nights of Love, Recipes for Disaster, an Anarchist Cookbook, and Expect Resistance. Get that stuff up here. Their latest publication work, Capitalist Economics Resistance, is an affront against the forms of labor which produce the cultural content of the commodity. Their body of action has consisted of spectacular, participatory, consensus-based organizing, which we are all seeing a resurgence of in the current venue for refusing capitalist logic. In work, which this conversation will largely be based on, Crimethinc urges its readers to recognize an occupation, realizing that, quote, our lives are occupied territory, end quote, and that any form of freedom and liberation will only come when individuals and groups begin to take back the time, labor, and consciousness which has been divided and conquered by the regulations of capitalism. Furthermore, and my favorite part about it, Crimethinc converges joy with resistance and magic with revolution in their process of dismantling hierarchies in a way which invokes rather than invites. With that said, I'll let Crimethinc dig into their spellbook and stir up what we think is possible.
For that introduction. I'm actually not sure that we can live up to it. And thanks to all of you for coming here. This is the biggest group that we've talked to in some time. Yeah, since fall. Also, if people in the back want to come forward, it looks like there's space up here that might make it easier on y'all and on us. If you don't, just let us know if you can't hear us. So as Danielle said, we're doing this talk about work, capitalism, and resistance. And this did start with a book project that we both contributed to called Work. And what it was basically was our response to this situation where more and more people in the US were talking about capitalism. We're talking about the economy, we're talking about the crisis, and at the same time, there were all these experts out there to tell you exactly what the crisis was, exactly what the economy was, exactly what capitalism was, and every time the experts told you that, it was always something outside, something out there, not something about you and your lives. And the truth is, actually, what they're talking about is our lives. When we talk about capitalism, we're talking about its effects on our bodies. So we wanted to write a book that would give a sort of panoramic view of our experience of capitalism, but not from the perspective of experts, but from the perspective of our own experience and the experience of the people that we know. And to try and give some sort of historical grounding for where we see ourselves as being at today. Now, when this workbook went to press was last March, right? And right around the same time, we saw the beginnings of what's become a global wave of resistance. With the Tunisian uprising that flared up and spread across North Africa, the Middle East. And then later in this country, in Wisconsin, and soon after that with the Occupy movement in the fall, I'm sure you're all familiar with. And so as we were doing these speaking tours, we sort of tried to constantly update what we were doing and constantly learn from the resistance that was going on. Learn from our own experience, our own involvement in that. And also we had the opportunity to visit a lot of occupations across the US, for instance, and learn from what was going on the ground there. So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to start by laying out our understanding of capitalism and work, and then talk a little bit about the specific history we see as the development of capitalism to get us where we are today. And that includes the history of resistance, because there is a history of resistance, and that's where we come from. And then finally, we're going to talk about contemporary examples of resistance, contemporary struggles. I said before, I'll say again, if you want to come forward, please do. That makes it easier on us. But more importantly, we're not really used to speaking at universities. Universities are kind of weird spaces because they're designed for us to think that this is just some meeting of the minds, you know, and when you go home, it's going to be exactly the same as when we showed up. And that's not what we're about. We're about our lives, we're about our bodies. So as we're talking, please don't let the fluorescent lights put you to sleep. Please, if you like what we're saying, show it, nod. If you don't like what we're saying, make a mean face. You know, if you have clarifying questions, please raise your hand and ask. And if you have more discussion-oriented questions, just save those for the end, and we'll have plenty of time at the end of the talk to open up and have a conversation. So, you want to get us started?
Sure. So somebody throw out a definition of work. Just labor. Okay. That's pretty broad. Let's try to make that more precise.
Intentional effort.
Intentional effort. Now it's true. There's a physics definition of what work is, and that's clearly not what we're here to talk about. So what else?
Intentional effort that's going to be converted to money.
There could be what with money? Converted into money. Right. Okay. Do you want to hit it with the red bandana in the back?
Alienation.
Alienation. What I'm going for is something between those, because I don't actually think that you know, people often say wage labor. Work is wage labor. You know, and I think that's not enough, right? Because all right, for example, slavery. Was slavery work?
Yes.
Right. Okay. How about anybody here ever had an internship? I'm guessing somebody probably did, right? Okay. Was that work?
Yes.
Right. Okay. Now. But let's go a little further. How about filling out a job application? Is that work?
Yes.
Do you have a clarifying question?
Yeah.
When you're considering slavery as work, is this sort of universal to all slavery, or is it specific to slavery in the American context of slavery as a production of commodities?
I guess generally I'm trying to figure out the Venn diagram of what we're going to be talking about tonight. So I'm not going to try to make that more precise, actually. Do you want to?
Production of value.
Production of value. Again, that's a. Let me give a few more examples, and we'll try to figure out what they have in common, if you will. What do you say? Time. Well, time can pass and you can be working, or pass and you're not working, right? Let me give another couple examples though to try to pin down what we want to talk about here. All right, if you can agree that filling out a job application is work, how about when you're updating your Facebook page? But as you do it, you're thinking about what will make you more employable. So you're not doing it in an enjoyable fashion, you're doing it in a fashion to sell yourself. That could conceivably count as work, right? You know? I'm going to take that further. What if you're at a party and you meet, you know, you're trying to hang out with all those interesting people, you meet this really boring person at the party, you know? And you'd like to get away from that person as quickly as you can, but you realize that that person could probably get you a job. And so you have to spend hours talking them up, figuring out how to turn the conversation around to how you're an herbalist, in fact, and you do these workshops. And, you know, and in addition to that, actually, you know a lot about horticulture, you know, just trying to figure out how to get, is that work?
Yes.
All right, let me give another example. Because I don't want us to get bogged down here. I want to get into the meat of what we're actually here to talk about momentarily. Let's say that your husband comes back from his job, and after taking care of all of your kids, and cleaning your house, you have to listen to him spout off about how frustrating his job was. And this is expected of you. It's not wage labor, you know. It's not productive activity, except in the sense of caregiving. but you're doing something that you never would have had to do if he didn't have this ridiculous, have to spend all this time in this ridiculous alienating environment that chokes him up full of frustration, right? Does this sound familiar to anybody? Mm-hmm. Is that work?
Yes.
Okay, so far everything that I've talked about, is something that happens to employees or people who are around them. But I want to pan back from that a little bit more. Anybody here self-employed? Throw up your hand. All right. I don't know if this will resonate with you, but my experience when I was self-employed, at first I was like, well, it'll be great. I won't have a boss. It won't be like work. Actually, the economy is your boss directly, right? And the economy can be a more demanding and a more, imposing boss than any human boss. Human boss turns his back. You can get some money out of the cash register, goes off, whatever, right? I mean, if the economy is directly rewarding and punishing your activity, you are even more integrated to the functionings of capitalism than you were when you worked for somebody else. Now, it's easy for us to imagine this when we're talking about somebody working in a hot dog stand. But let's go all the way up to the top of the pyramid. Say you're an executive working for ExxonMobil. One morning you wake up and you're like, oh my God, I'm destroying the world. Why am I doing this? You run out and instead of getting on your car, you get on your bicycle. You bike really angrily to the ExxonMobil headquarters. You run into the boardroom and you say, fellow executives, we have the chance to save Earth. Why don't we just do that instead of this dumb thing that we're doing? Well, sit down, Bob. Let me get you some coffee. Now, I'll remind you, right? As soon as we do something that is ethically grounded rather than something that is competitive, rather than something that is effective at accumulating profit in our hands, the stock market will root all of the capital that's invested in ExxonMobil out of our company and into a more competitive one. That can happen in 10 minutes, in today's economy. So what that says to me is that even when you hold power in capitalism, you can only use that power to pursue the logic of capitalism. And that gets a little bit at what we want to talk about with work.
Let me make something clear. I don't feel sorry for executives. I don't think Brian does either. They've made their bed. They can sleep in it. But when we talk about capitalism, and when we hear this rhetoric of the 1%, the 99%, it's not a problem of a few greedy people, and if they just weren't so greedy, all the problems would be solved. It's a problem of a social system, and I would say that the thing that all of those activities Brian mentioned have in common is that they're all governed by the logic of capitalism. What I mean when I say capitalism is I mean a social system where power is determined by profit. Now, there are all sorts of different ways that power could be determined, right? There are all sorts of different ways that society could be organized. We can imagine a society where power is a matter of the family you're born into, or your ability to directly coerce those around you. Or, we could imagine a society where power actually means your willingness and ability to act, to show solidarity with those around you, to collectively meet your needs together. And it could mean all sorts of different things. But that's not the world we live in. The world we live in is a capitalist one where power means profit. What does profit mean? We don't think about this that often, but what are we talking about when we talk about profit? Somebody, anybody?
Surplus value.
Surplus value. All right. So if I want to turn a profit and get some surplus value, what do I do?
Exploit your laborers.
Exploit my laborers. But how am I going to exploit them?
Well, you sell something. You want to make profit.
That's right. I got to sell something. I can't just I can exploit Brian all day long, but if I don't sell something eventually, it's something other than work. So you have to sell something. You have to invest capital, right? Capitalism, capital. You have to invest some kind of wealth, give up the use of it for a little while, put it on the stock market, sink it into a factory, whatever. And then you get a return on your investment. That's your profit, right? Any capitalist will tell you that. Any businessman will tell you that. All right, in order to do this, there's a lot of things that you need in a society. You need money, for instance. You need some way that you can turn the stuff that you've got into something you can put in your pocket, something you can send across the world. You need a market, right? You need somewhere that you can exchange things, somewhere where you can buy and sell. And to have a money supply, to have a market, all these things require a lot of social institutions. They require a state. They require police to protect the private property that ensures the integrity of the market. So a lot of things are implied just by having a society based on profit. I want to talk about two specific things that are implied by that. Right? The first one is once you have some people in a society, some capitalists in a society that are able to exercise or even maintain power by turning a profit, pretty soon everybody in a society has to do the same thing, has to play the capitalist game. So, historically, first there were some merchants, right? In Europe, buying and selling around the Mediterranean, maybe some overseas exploration and pillaging, And then pretty soon, those lords of the manor, the people that used to be powerful in society, they had to play that game too, right? If they wanted to maintain their power in society, right? And more importantly, people who don't have wealth they can invest, but maybe they have, the customary use of some land where they grow food to feed themselves and their family. They maybe have a house that's been in their family for generations and generations, and that's just how they live. Those things become wealth, become capital, but they can't invest them. They can't play that game. And so the wealth that they do have, the stuff that they do have, means less and less. The power that they might have once had means less and less. They become powerless. They become disempowered. And so they lose that land. They lose that house until all that they have is themselves, their bodies, their time, their capabilities. And they have to sell that. They have to sell that to someone who can invest, who can exploit them. And that's where work in a capitalist society comes from. And every time, historically, that you look at the extension of capitalism across the globe, you'll see that the first thing that happens is dispossession. The first thing that happens is the destruction of the traditional way of life in the society that capitalism is entering. And that's the first thing I wanted to say about that. The second thing I want to say is that capitalism is a dynamic kind of social organization. It's not a static one, right? And that also means that it's a volatile one. Because if you want to turn a profit, if you want to outcompete the other people trying to turn a profit, you have to accumulate more and more stuff. You have to have more and more wealth, more and more capital. And if everybody is doing that at the same time, accumulating more and more, then eventually every little thing that you accumulate, every new Model T, is actually worth less compared to what's out there on the market. And what that means is it gets harder and harder to turn a profit. And if the whole society is based on turning a profit, that means that things are falling apart. Things are falling apart at the seams, and they're always falling apart at the seams. And so throughout the history of capitalism, we see this continual history of reorganization, new ways of distributing people and society in order to counteract that basic volatility. It's a constant history of patching up something that's falling apart. And that's important when we think about where we're at today. You want to talk a little bit about that history?
Well, like Andrew said, capitalism is always being threatened from outside and from inside. When I say outside, I don't really mean outside. I mean from people like us who are trapped inside of it. Rebels, We think of the spread of capitalism, we think of the Industrial Revolution, which took place a couple hundred years ago in Europe and is just finishing now in parts of Brazil, Nepal. From the beginning, the people who were being displaced by the new looms, went and burned them, broke them. Throw up your hand if you've heard of the Luddites. Most of y'all, right? How many of y'all know that at one point more of the British Army was fighting the Luddites than was fighting Napoleon? Right? Now, fast forward, the same people who, you smash the looms, they build them again, pretty soon you're out of a job and you have to work for them. That explains the revolutions of the 19th century. People were not having it, they took over Paris, it took the French military to take it back in 1871. A lot of the unions that we're familiar with today are descended from these original workers organizations in the 19th century. But those were not law-abiding, dues-collecting, public organizations in many cases. Many of those were basically secret societies that would meet around a fire in the middle of the night to plot mayhem, to plot the abolition of work, So on the one hand, at the beginning of the 20th century, you have all of these forces, all of these revolutions brewing. And on the other side, you have the limitations of, of the capitalist system itself coming to the fore. I'll give a concrete example of this. Let's say that you are in the business to sell cars. What do you do once you've sold a car to every rich person? Right, but how are you going to sell them to poor people?
Discount.
What do you say?
You discount.
Yeah, you discount them. How are you going to afford to do that? What do you say?
Keep out important materials.
Mm-hmm. Well, what else?
Debt. Financing.
Yeah, financing, debt.
Pay your workers less.
Pay your workers less.
Make it a necessity.
Yeah, make it. All these are things that are true. But what I'm looking for is make the work process itself, make the production process more efficient, right? This is what Henry Ford sets out to do in 1914. You know, he's got this new idea. He's like, if I look at the factory like it was a machine, and I set out to make it a more efficient machine, maybe I could actually make the cars for cheaper, and then I could sell them to more people. First year that he does this, he has, he's like, all right, everybody has to behave like your machine, just stay in one place doing one thing. He has to hire 10 workers for every one job opening because people are so bored. People don't want to be machines. Just like the Luddites went and smashed the machines that replaced them, Ford's workers are quitting in droves, right? So he has to go back to the drawing board, and he comes back and he's like, all right, we will pay workers twice the going rate to work in our factories. Now, the capitalists think he's crazy. The other capitalists think he's insane, right? How are you going to make out like this? But he's actually able to speed up what he's doing so effectively that he can make a lot of money. But the most interesting thing that happens here is that he has inadvertently created a new consumer body. Right? He's created a much broader range of people who, because of the credit that you mentioned in the back, can afford to buy his cars. And more interesting than that, he's created what I'm going to call the Fordist compromise. He's created the origins of the middle class as we knew it until recently in North America. Right? He's created this social body that has an interest in participating in capitalism. If you get credit and you buy the car on credit, you're not just committing that you will work that day. You're not just giving up your labor, your productivity for that day. You're giving it up for that day, the next week, next month, next year, next decade. You're saying, in return for a part of what I produce, I'm willing to give up my control over what it is I do with my potential as a human being. And not only that, I'm willing to participate in creating a subservient working class culture in return for these commodities.
Yeah, just to add to that, another thing that happens at the same time is the legalization of unions in this country, and actually in many countries across the world. These same, what used to be these illegal secret societies plotting mayhem in the night. Unions are legalized so long as they do a certain thing, so long as they limit themselves to negotiating wages, to negotiating wage increases. And the thing I want to emphasize about this is that it creates a role for these unions within the workings of capitalism. Because not every capitalist is as smart as Henry Ford, right? Not every capitalist is going to do what's in the best interests of capitalism as a whole. Not every capitalist is going to do what it takes to stabilize capitalism. What the unions do by keeping wages up enough that there's some kind of middle class that can afford to buy products, that can create a consumer market, they broker the peace treaty that Brian's talking about. They make it possible to have this middle class compromise. So I just want to emphasize that it's not just some conspiracy from above. It's a massive social change.
Right. And I want to emphasize also, this compromise wasn't extended to everybody. This peace treaty wasn't extended to the entire working class. We're talking chiefly about white men, in fact. But it did give everyone something to aspire to be part of. We want in on this peace treaty also, right? And the main thing that it did was it stabilized people in fixed roles within the system. My grandfather worked for Goodyear, a rubber factory, for 50 years. Who here thinks that they're going to work any job for 50 years? Right? Maybe if you get to be a Supreme Court justice and you live to be 130. That's your only hope, basically. So one of the things that we're going to get at tonight is how that has changed the workforce, how that has changed our prospects, and how that has to change the ways we fight. Because when my grandfather thought about fighting for his interests as a worker, he thought about going on strike. The last general strike in the United States of the 20th century, in Oakland, actually, in 1946. That was made up of union rank and file people. Once again, as Andrew pointed out, it was not union led. The union bureaucracy didn't call for it. They just came in at the end and said, okay, everybody can go home. But union rank and file people fighting for their rights as workers, fighting for wage increases, fighting for a bigger piece of the pie was the way that people fought. And it made sense in that context because, on the backs of people in the rest of the world, it was possible to extend certain privileges to people in the United States. Is everybody with me so far? All right, so fast forward to the 1960s. On the one hand, again, you have new revolts coming up. My parents' generation revolted against the compromises that their parents had made. And at the same time, okay, let's say that you sold a car to every rich person, maybe a couple of cars to every one of them, and a car to every middle-class person. There's nobody else you can sell cars to. How are you going to keep making a profit?
Make the car shake so they break so people have to find new ones.
Yeah, make the cars more cheaply.
Make a better car.
Make a better car. Diversify the range of products you're selling.
Planned obsolescence.
Planned obsolescence, like what you're saying too. The main thing though, if Henry Ford looked at the factory like it was a machine and set out to make it a more efficient machine, what capitalists in the 1960s and 1970s do, and y'all know about this, globalization, they look at the world like it's a machine. They say, if the whole world was a machine just for making more profit for us, how would we make that a more efficient machine? Well, for one thing, we have these factories paying decent wages to workers in North America. Why would we keep them here when we have pillaged people in other parts of the world? We could send the factories there, they'll work for pennies, Send the factory to Mexico. As soon as people start to organize there, no problem. Send it to the Philippines. If they organize there, send it to Singapore. They turn the world into an interlocking web of conveyor belts, of assembly lines, where every node can immediately be moved somewhere else as soon as there's resistance. What's the problem with this plan?
You're going to run out of places eventually.
Well, it sucks in the whole world, it's true, and eventually you've used up all the resources and the temperature's going up mysteriously. What you got?
When it does extend itself to the entire world, there's really no possibility of a global revolution.
That's the problem for us, although I'm not sure. Ultimately, I'm not sure if that's true. But I think the problem that Brian is getting at is actually that once you break this peace treaty, right? Once you break this peace treaty, then you don't have a consumer market anymore.
The people who are buying your cars can't.
So the old way of getting through the crisis is thrown out the window in this new way of getting through a new crisis.
When do y'all think credit cards were introduced?
70s, late 60s.
80s, I think. Imagine tanks are rolling into Prague. Students are getting gunned down in Mexico City. Yeah, 68 is the year those things happen. I mean, so capitalists are like, how do we extend this peace treaty? How do we extend this way of making profit a little bit further, right? Well, okay, we'll extend credit further, right? We'll just have people promise us more and more of their future. How much sense, though, does it make to gamble that people who are too poor to pay you now are going to be wealthier later when the whole system is premised on you getting more and more money relative to them? It's craziness, right? So you rack up all these debts, people get poorer and poorer, are less and less capable of paying you off. Boom, 2008, the recession hits.
Are y'all with us so far?
Yeah, no way recession.
Right. So we're about up to the present now, and I just want to say again, we're not here to have another history lecture at Columbia College, right? We're not talking about this just because it's very interesting to talk about the past. We're not talking about this because we really care a whole lot about economics. That's not why we're here. We're here because we're talking about our lives. For example, what Brian was saying a minute ago, this fragmentation, I'm going to call it, of production, where the whole world becomes a network of invisible conveyor belts, and one little bit of the machine is made over here, sent halfway across the world, another little bit, the whole world is a factory. That fragmentation isn't just something that happens to the production process. It's not just something that happens to factories. Okay? Because what do you need in order to have a world like that? a world of interlocking conveyor belts. You need an unprecedented ability to communicate. You need all this communication technology, and that's why in the same few decades that we're talking about, you see this explosion of information technology and communication technology, right? And that shapes our lives. Who here does not have a cell phone? Awesome. Bless your hearts. Oh my God, 4 people in a city. Seriously, that's awesome. I held out till like a couple of years ago. Who here, show of hands, checks their email every day? The vast majority of the people in this room. All right. Raise your hands again. Who here could not do the work that they do if they didn't check their email every day? And if you're a student, that means the work you do as a student, being a student. All right. The majority of the people in this room.
Could this event have happened without that?
Yeah, could this event have happened?
Well, it could have.
In fact, 100 years ago, there were lectures in which, anarchist revolutionaries stood up in front of giant crowds and tried to incite them to extreme acts. But in the world that we live in today, because of the way that it's been restructured, because of the way that it's been fragmented, the way that our lives have been fragmented, it would not be possible. And that's the point that I'm trying to make, is that this fragmentation isn't just something out there. It's what we live. We all have to be constantly in touch. We all have to be able to remake ourselves every minute. That's the #1 job qualification that everybody in this room has. So that's just something that I want to always emphasize. This is about our lives, not about something out there. Now I want to step back for a minute, talk a little bit more about technology. Because 100 years ago, there were utopians, right? There were utopians who went on lecture tours across the country and stood in front of rooms of people, maybe bigger rooms than this, and they said, we can live in a different world. We can live in a better world. A world where all these problems, all this misery is not here anymore. And when they said that, what did they say was going to make that world possible? Machines, right? Technology. In 100 years ago, the means of production
in 100 years.
Yeah, in 100 years. The means of production will have advanced to the point that nobody will have to work. The machines will do it for us, and we're just going to sit around on pillows, writing poetry, and smoking opium. Right? In 100 years ago, the means of production will have...
You did it again.
The means of production will have advanced to the point where we can produce enough food to feed everyone. Nobody globally will go hungry. Now tell me, do we have to work?
Yes.
Yes. Do people go hungry?
Yes.
Yes. Okay? What happened instead? What we got instead of this utopia is a world where, indeed, we're less and less necessary to produce the things we use from day to day. It's harder and harder to find a job making the stuff that we need for our survival. But we're still trapped within the logic of work. So what do we do instead? When we're more and more disposable to the things that actually sustain our lives? Well, on the one hand, we do service work. Probably a lot of people in this room have had service jobs or do right now, right? What's service work? Service work is putting a human face on these increasingly meaningless commodities, a thin layer of flesh covering that machinery. Right? What else? Well, here's another thing that used to be marginal to the capitalist economy: illegal capitalism. Hustling when basically all the other alternatives are even more precarious. Right? That's something that's increasingly prevalent in our world. Increasingly what we do when we're disposable within capitalism. What else? Well, in a university like this, there's all this information work, right? Because capitalists aren't really just competing over more efficient production of stuff. They're competing over ways of coordinating that giant global network. And so people can get jobs basically processing this flow of information. What else? Well, if you can't get any of these jobs, you're unemployed. The reason I mention unemployment is that unemployment doesn't just mean you're somehow outside of the market. The crucial thing about unemployment is that it keeps you integrated within the market. Everybody here that's been unemployed knows that that's actually a job. The work of finding a job is the most thankless work you can do, but it's still a job, and you have to keep thinking of yourself as a worker, even more than when you are a worker. Okay? The reason I mention that is because I want to talk about the most important, or I don't know, just most massive way that unemployment is managed in this country to keep people integrated into the market, and that's the prison system. Right? Mm-hmm. In the same period of decades that we've been talking about, there's a huge expansion of the prison system in the United States. Well, what is the prison? It's what, 2.4 million people a day, right? Which is more than the number of people in the gulags at the height of Stalin's reign. Right? This is the society we live in. What's the first thing you have to do when you leave prison? Get a job. Hmm?
That wasn't really get a job.
Well, yeah, I mean, you might not be able to get a job, but you better try. You know, it's an impossible demand, but it is the demand, and that's because prison exists to keep people integrated into capitalism. There are other aspects of it, right? It inherits the legacy of racism in this country, for instance. But that's a crucial piece of it. What else do we do when we're unnecessary to produce the things we need for survival, but still trapped within the logic of work? Well, if you don't want to do illegal capitalism, you don't want to be unemployed, but you can't find a job, maybe you're an entrepreneur. This can be people starting small businesses, or it can just be somebody in this room selling jewelry on Etsy, right? And it's not even just that. It's also anybody here who has ever posted on Craigslist trying to invent some kind of selling point for themselves so they can get money somehow. Entrepreneurship is creating new selling points when that's the only way to make money in our society, is new selling points. Now, there are a couple reasons to talk about entrepreneurship. The first one is that once you create those selling points, that's what drives capitalist innovation. That's part of the cutting edge of capitalism today. So you talk about health food co-ops in the 70s, right? Eventually that creates a selling point, organic vegetables, because all of a sudden the bulk of our food isn't organic. And then Whole Foods can come in, and there's a Whole Foods in every city across the United States selling this new selling point and monopolizing the ability to live a good and healthy life. The other reason I talk about entrepreneurship is because it requires something of us that's crucial to our lives within capitalism today, and it's self-management, right? When you're an entrepreneur, you don't have someone telling you what to do, but you have to figure it out yourself. When you're self-employed, same thing. And self-management isn't just something that happens for entrepreneurs either. I'm going to give you two examples. First, do y'all remember that recruitment poster for the military, Army of One? You know what I'm talking about? Okay, well, think about that for a second. A couple hundred years ago, a soldier was the example of a cog in the machine, right? The techniques of discipline that regulated workers in factories, those were invented in the military. March forward when I tell you to, shoot when I tell you to, die when I tell you to. Well, all of a sudden in the 21st century, what's a soldier? A soldier is not a cog in the machine, they're an empowered individual. That's what the manuals say. An empowered individual who's not getting orders, they're getting information on the battlefield, and they have all this space-age technology to implement that. So they're self-managing this industry of death. Right? They're not entrepreneurs, but they still have to become self-managed. Go over to the other end, the other side of the gun. What's the hot new thing in international development today? Microlending, right? Microfinance. Microfinance is this thing where rather than sending in an army of development experts to, remake a society, bring it up to the 21st century, bring it into the market, instead you empower some individuals within a community to bring their community up to date, to create something healthy for themselves, right? So long as it obeys the logic of the market, so long as it serves the market, right? So all across society, we see more and more of these capitalist activities being self-managed. And that's important because it's not just something that we do at work, it's something that we do in every waking hour. It's something that we have to do in every waking hour. And most importantly, it's something that often we do even when we think we're resisting, right? Or in the language of Columbia College, when we think we're creating change. I saw that on the billboard driving up here, and it's insane. But that's exactly what that is. That's branding for self-management, and that's what you need to succeed in this society. Okay? I'm just going to recap all of this because this is a whole bunch of different things. This is that panorama of the world we live in today. But the crucial thing is, those utopians that promised us a world without work, was it a lie? Yes and no. The lie was that we would live in a world without work, but actually the thing that they said would give us that has happened. And so we're actually increasingly integrated into capitalism and at the same time increasingly disposable, increasingly vulnerable. And because of the globalization that made this possible, we're all part of the same vulnerable global labor pool. And that's what the barista in Milwaukee has in common with the person in the shanty town in New Delhi, right? That's what the carpenter in North Carolina has in common with the art school student at Columbia, Chicago, right? What we have in common is a shared vulnerability. And also what that means is that globally, we now have a shared stake in revolt. You want to talk about what revolt means today?
Right. This is why we're here, actually. Thank you for listening through all our context, but we're really here to talk about what it is that we can do together to fight against capitalism, to establish the possibility of other ways of life and other ways of relating. And the past year and a half has been a really promising period for that, actually. We want to talk about what has been taking off and why, so we can learn the lessons of the last phase of struggle, right? So, a year ago last December, in Tunisia, a man on the margin of society sets himself on fire to protest the police preventing him from even making a living as a fruit vendor, right? Now, I want to emphasize, poor folks and marginalized folks have always been revolting, have always been standing up for themselves. And in a society like the one that my grandfather lived in, people have every reason not to look out for them, to turn a blind eye. Why today, when that man set himself on fire in Tunisia and a few hundred people who cared about him revolted, why did that spread? Why did everybody join in?
Social media. Access to information is a lot easier to see and to spread.
Yeah, that's... And that,
That's not enough to know about it, you also have to care.
Right. Let me say something about
everyone
that.
now.
We can all relate to that.
Right.
We could all be him.
Right. And that's interesting, right? That's a new thing where you said in the back that once everybody is sucked into this, it's impossible for there to be a revolution. It may be inevitable. It may be inevitable and impossible. We'll get to that. But on the one hand, the social media are interesting because that's us being integrated to what I was calling this global network of assembly lines, right? In order for us to be integrated to the global factory floor, we have to participate in this thing that also makes global revolt possible. And on the other side, when everybody, like you say, when everybody is one wrong step away from the bottom, suddenly everyone who shares this vulnerability can see what there is to be gained from a revolt. And people in small town Iowa are fantasizing about being in Egypt, burning down police stations, non-violently, as Obama called it. Tunisia. In Tunisia, I want to emphasize this also. In the New World, there are no margins. Tunisia is not the middle of the Middle East. It's not the middle of the world. But what happens in Tunisia can have a huge impact everywhere because of the global context. There isn't a center that things begin from now. And it wasn't in Tunisia. I want to emphasize this too. In Tunisia, it wasn't the people at the center of society either. It was the most marginal folks. So, Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, You know, pretty soon in North America, people are carrying signs saying, "You fight like an Egyptian." Where was the first place this happened? Right, and why, what I'm going to ask now is, why did people not win their fight? Why? Let me put it differently. Why did the fight in Madison, Wisconsin not go as far as it had in Egypt?
The Democrats.
That's yeah, you know. What do you say? Yeah,
No, because they were trapped in the structure.
Because they were what?
Because they were trapped in the top-down structure.
Because they were trapped in a top-down structure. That's a good way to put what you said.
There's so many police officers here in this country.
Well, yeah, there are a lot of police here, but you know, that's
so many military means.
right.
But
Egypt got the second.
Why is it harder for,
Yeah.
for public sector workers in Wisconsin to defend their right to collectively bargain than to overthrow the most highly funded military dictator in the world?
Right. That's I want to repeat that again, and I'm going to repeat it as empirical evidence. Today, it is easier to overthrow the most highly funded dictator in the world than it is to win collective bargaining rights for workers in the United States. We're in an era when revolution is easier than reform. You know, and I want to say more about that, right? The folks in Wisconsin that were protesting, the protest started as people were waiting in line to speak at the state legislature. So like you said, it began as something that was structured into making requests from the top down. There's more to this though. You know, what would it take for a revolt to kick off in a time when everyone is vulnerable? You know, well, it might not be enough to try to defend the privileges of one sector of the social body. You know, to defend that particular sector from being as vulnerable as everybody else. You know, if you go to Milwaukee, you know, there are unemployed African American folks there that had no reason to be in Madison, standing up for the rights of the employed public sector employees. You know, they had no reason to. You know, first they came for me, nobody cared about me, so I'm here. Next they came for the public sector employees, and fuck them. You know, I understand that. Now, this is a situation where we can't win concessions for ourselves as individual groups. This is a situation where we actually have to fight together in a way that starts from our collective vulnerability, even if we're not all on the same level.
Let me put that a different
Please.
way. When nobody in this society is going to maintain a fixed role within capitalism, where everything is flowing around constantly in this globalized world, defensive struggles to maintain fixed rules are losing struggles.
So, fortunately, it didn't, it didn't begin in Tunisia and it didn't end in Wisconsin, right? Back in August, we did another version of the speaking tour, and we were saying what it would take for there to be something like what happened in North Africa and the United States would be for it to begin outside of a particular workplace, outside of a particular sector of the workforce, starting from our shared vulnerability. And in fact, we for good or for ill, we got our wish granted, right? The reason that Occupy took off and went further than anybody anticipated it doing was because it started from that shared vulnerability, from the thing that downwardly mobile middle-class bureaucrats have in common with homeless people. That's I want to drive that home. You know, even in Egypt, where there is a powerful union movement, the revolt didn't start from the unions. And what does that look like then when we fight here? I'm going to say the high point, and I'm assigning this arbitrarily, but for me the high point of Occupy North America, I would say would be November 2nd, the general strike in Oakland.
Yeah.
Right? And you can argue that there was some other high point, but taking this hypothetically as the high point, let's compare that to the last time that people tried to have a general strike in Oakland. You know, in 1946, there were 400 or 500 department store workers out on strike, and when the police brought in scabs, brought in materials to try to break the strike, everyone revolted and shut down the main, the center of the city. They wouldn't let people into the city unless they had union cards. They're saying, because of our fixed roles in capitalism, we can, we are the city, we can shut it down, right? What happened in 2011? When people are coming together in the park, in downtown Oakland, on the basis of not having fixed roles, on the basis of not having fixed positions in capitalism, you know? I was just in Oakland a few weeks ago, and I was talking to a lot of different people there. One person I talked to, I was like, well, what did you think of the general strike? And she's like, well, you know, I'm a sex worker, right? What does it mean for me to go on general strike? It just means that I don't get paid, you know, for one day. Maybe back in the day, I would have been working in a brothel or something, and we could have gone all lysistrata, right? But nowadays, like, you know, it just means I work for less one day, right? You know, because I'm self-managing my work, you know? So what does it look like in this era for there to be a general strike? And once again, when the functioning of the economy depends on fewer and fewer people, it's easier and easier to hire the scabs to keep the economy running, while the rest of us suffer the effects. You know? So the consensus in Oakland was, we will not just go on strike ourselves, we will interrupt the functioning of the economy. And I want to drive home, this is actually the future of any kind of working class self-defense in North America and in the world. When people marched to the port, when people marched into functioning workplaces and shut them down and shut the port down, that is, because of the structure, that is the only hope for working class leverage, if you even want to call us working class anymore. That is the only hope for us to have leverage on the world that we live in. And in Oakland afterwards, there was all this controversy, you know? Well, why are these like students and homeless people shutting down the port? Shouldn't it be port workers? You know, I want to say, if you don't have a job, you are more entitled than ever to shut down somebody else's workplace. If you can't afford to go to school, you are more entitled to occupy a school than anyone who can afford to, right? Otherwise, how are we going to have a powerful movement for social change? Because this year's protesters against tuition hikes are going to be next year's dropouts, right? This year's people who go on strike will be next year's unemployed. So, to tie up here though, for the last part of our presentation, I want to say, Occupy Whatever didn't overthrow capitalism. And for me, that's okay. Occupy had all sorts of shortcomings as far as who was involved, whose voices were prioritized. You know, maybe Occupy is not the movement that we need to overthrow capitalism. But Occupy, let's say, is a necessary phase in the development of an anti-capitalist movement. Yeah, I'm not even going to argue that. You know, yeah. For me, the anti-capitalist movement breathes. It takes in more people. You know, it contracts. It breathes again. Maybe the next breath won't be Occupy. Maybe it will be something else. But I want to say, some people, when they look at the contradictions within something like Occupy, they say, well, we could be more effective if we would just self-police. If we could all get on one page and all try to do one thing. You know, if we could suppress all of our differences, we'd be more effective.
Right. Maybe we wouldn't have been evicted by force.
Right. Yeah, I'm going to say, for me, the contradictions, the tensions in Occupy are the most interesting, and we can learn tremendously from those. One of the contradictions, one of the internal tensions in Occupy that I want to bring out is the tension between the push for representative solutions versus the push to create autonomous sites of power. Who here remembers the original Adbusters call for September 17th in New York? What was it they called for people to do once they had occupied Wall Street? Right, come up with one demand, right? We were all going to get together and have some big consensus meeting, sort of in imitation of the people inside the halls of legislature. We were going to come up with one demand that we would ceaselessly repeat until Obama was forced to grant it to us. Now, fortunately, most of the people who gave Occupy flesh were smarter than this, right? Had a stronger, sharper analysis, you know? They're like, why would we make ourselves just one more political action committee? Why would we make ourselves just one more group seeking leverage, you know? The leverage will come if we build strength, you know? So that's, from the beginning, Occupy took off and succeeded because it seceded from merely legislative politics towards creating autonomous sites of power.
Right. Now that tension, just to be clear, it's not like that tension was resolved on day one of Occupy Wall Street, as anybody who's been involved in these occupations knows. Actually, that was continuous throughout. You had people who saw the occupations as a tactic, a publicity stunt, right? You know, and they got really mad at people who came in and made them look bad, you know, right? So that was a constant tension throughout, and all of these tensions came to the fore as the occupation started to dwindle, decline, and be evicted by force. Then there's all kinds of infighting. Everybody blames everybody else, right? This is familiar to those of you who have been involved. Right? Well, I want to talk about another tension that existed throughout, but really came to the fore at the end. And we saw this in our town. We've heard about it in many different towns, big cities. We heard about it in New York, small towns with like 10 people in the occupation. And that's the tension between competing conceptions of what that site of power is, right? What that autonomous site of power can and should be. What I mean is, on the one hand, you have people who believe that the focus of the movement, the focus of Occupy, fill in the blank, is the General Assembly, right? The place where we meet, where we talk through our ideas together, where we come to some conclusion, decide what we're going to do next, right? Consensus democracy. On the other hand, you have people who see the focus of the movement as the encampments, right? The physical spaces where people are coming together, the physical spaces of encounter, the physical spaces of acting together and meeting as collective. Now, I'm not going to take a side in this battle between the assemblyists and the campers. What I'm going to say is that there's a grain of truth in each of those, but you know, the fact that degenerated into infighting by the end reveals that neither one of them has really got the whole picture. Just to pause for a second, those of you who have been involved in occupation, is this conflict familiar to you?
We didn't really have one here.
We didn't have.
Oh, okay, well, I saw some yeses. This is something that I've heard all over the country. What I'm going to say is that the assemblyists, the part that they have right, is that encampments without a movement are not going anywhere. Right? What the campers have right is that a movement that doesn't involve physical spaces of encounter and actual action on the ground is not a movement. So to put it otherwise, what we need is political movements that expand the sites of power, the physical, material sites of power, and create new ones. And on the other hand, we need encampments, we need sites of power that generate political momentum, rather than retreating into a merely defensive struggle to maintain a fixed role. You know, the role of pitching a tent in a park ringed by cops. Okay, everybody understand what I'm saying? Well, I'm gonna end that with an example of what I think that can look like. It's an example from our own town, and it's an experiment with trying to do this. So we had an occupation in our own town, and after about a month, it started to plateau, as did many of the occupations across the country at the same time. When I say plateau, I don't mean that it started to fall apart. What I mean is that there was nothing unpredictable about it anymore. The element of uncertainty was gone. The people that were there knew they were going to be there the next day. They knew what was going to happen. The people that weren't there, they weren't going to come. They knew exactly what was going to happen. The authorities also knew exactly what was going to happen the next day and the day after, the next week, the week after that. And that puts the ball back in the authorities' court, right? We only have power as long as we have the initiative. And so some of us who had been involved in setting up the occupation in the first place decided to take it a step further and try to create another site of power, another space where we can encounter each other and act together. And so we decided to occupy a building. There was a march organized for the night of November 12th. And as the march passed a 10,000 square foot building that had sat empty for 10 years on the main drag of our little college town, the doors flew open, banners unfurled, a few masked individuals came out and said, "Come in. If you feel this, come in." And most of the people in the march did. And that night, immediately people began to transform the space to create like kitchen facilities, bathroom facilities, to plan out a schedule of events. There was a dance party that night. There were meetings to try and envision what this social center could look like. There were leaflets distributed of one vision of it.
The leaflets were distributed with a blueprint of what the building would be if we were able to hold on to it and make it into a social center. And hundreds of people flowed in and out of the building. Hundreds of people of all walks of life around the town.
Right, and including people that maybe I knew but hadn't seen in months or years, people that I had never seen before. And there was this palpable energy to it, because something that we didn't think we could do, even those of us who were involved thought maybe we could hold it for 15 minutes and then we were going to go have a march somewhere else. We took the initiative and we surprised ourselves. And we didn't know what was possible next. Physical spaces that generate political momentum, political movement that creates new physical spaces, new material sites of power. What actually happened was about 24 hours later, the next day, a SWAT team came and raided the space. It was all over the news. SWAT teams usually don't carry out raids on the main drag of our liberal college town. Everybody was, just so offended by this. This isn't what police are supposed to do. Of course, we all know that's what police do all the time, right? But it brought it to the fore in a way that was really unexpected, and because this was linked to the Occupy movement, there was a big political scandal for the town. But that's not what I think is important. I don't care if liberals get offended by the police showing up. What I care about is 3 hours after this eviction, where we're standing across the street watching our comrades be arrested with machine guns pointed in our faces. 3 hours after this eviction, there was a benefit show, and immediately a black bloc left from the show, took the streets, and it was the biggest street march that had happened in our town in years. The biggest black bloc probably ever, right? And it wasn't just the usual suspects. It was people that I had never seen before, and some that I knew but wouldn't have, in 1,000 years, have imagined there. All right? That's another kind of site of power, right? That's another space of encounter. That's a new place where relationships are forged and the ability to act is formed. Similarly, the next day at the General Assembly for the Plaza occupation that some of us were still involved in, the General Assembly was the biggest since day one. The plateau was over because there was new momentum. There was some other possibility, and whether or not everybody there agreed with the way that things had happened or even the tactic itself, it's clear that that is what gave a new thrust to their own program. Okay, it helps all of us.
I'll add one more example of this. The next month, the Human Rights Center, a space providing support to Latino and Latina folks in our town, was being pushed out by their landlord. And normally I think that would have happened with a little bit of protest and nothing else. But because of this social movement that had kicked off, again, we were able to have a massive march of well over 100 people throughout the city, connect all of these different communities that had been disconnected before, and continue to build that autonomous site of power, which isn't just a physical space we're talking about. Although in a time when people are increasingly disenfranchised, folks will flow into any space that we can make common, any space that we can provide for our collective needs. So I want to conclude. We've been talking about economics, which is very serious. We've been talking about all this sort of the brutal functionings of the global economy, but I'm actually very optimistic that things are going to have to change soon. Many of us feel this in our day-to-day lives as we try to figure out how to survive. And speaking of the joy, which we were talking about at the beginning, I think the one thing that is joyous for me in this bleak time is the possibility that so many people are invested in connecting with each other about this and doing something. And in fact, I feel like we're going to have to.
Well, that concludes the formal part of our presentation. What we want to do now is open it up for some discussion. If you have questions for us, can ask them if you have comments or questions for each other, please do. All right, there's a couple hands, 1, 2.
It's just simple. What town you guys from? You guys kept saying a small little town. And I was like, that's so vague. What town might that be? I won't talk to you.
No, it's cool.
Do you want to turn off the camera for a second?
Yeah.
I'm sort of joking, but let's be
No,
honest.
seriously, I will if you want me to.
Let's be honest.
Settlers and sort of skip immediately to the 19th century and then also then skip to the 1960s uprest. Aren't we sort of skipping over a kind of two crucial transformative moments, namely the French Revolution of 1789, which sort of brings bourgeois rights along with already existing bourgeois social forms, and the 1917 Russian Revolution, which at its core sort of overturns capitalist relations over all of Russia, which is more than successive movements have been able to claim, even to try to want to do.
I want to say something about 1917. First, though, in the long drive from North Carolina to here, and stopping a couple places on the way, the main thing that we had to do is figure out what to subtract. Because we're trying to talk about hundreds of years of an infinity of events. But something, I appreciate you bringing up 1917. Remember, I was talking about what I call the Fordist Compromise, right? Where workers say that they will give up control over their potential. They will give up their freedom to make of their potential what they will, in return for a greater part of what they produce. And that happened in the United States, but it also happened in Russia, right? It also happened that there was, there were social upheavals that created in Russia and then elsewhere these nation states in which workers gave up a part of their freedom in return for a slightly greater share of what they produced. And in fact, that was as unsatisfying in the long run an arrangement for the workers there as it was here, or maybe even less satisfying. So, do you want to say any more about that?
Well, only that there was a moment in 1917 in Russia when a lot of things seemed possible. And I imagine that most of the people, fighting in the streets, most of the people behind the barricades, didn't expect that that was what they were fighting for and that was what they were going to get.
Yeah, no, I don't mean to write them out of history.
Right. Unfortunately, that's what happens many times in history, is revolutions that don't go far enough and fail. In the case of Russia, it's because power was immediately consolidated in a state, in a bureaucratic state, that then suppressed every other element of the revolution and recreated, a capitalist society based on a new compromise. So, that's not to say that there wasn't a moment of insurrection when a lot was possible, but only that moment passed very quickly, and that's a lesson we should learn from.
Yeah, and if it's messed up for me to try to write out of history the people who made that revolution possible by standing up for themselves, how much more messed up was it for the Bolsheviks who disappeared those people, who sent them to gulags, who ate themselves and each other alive until they didn't exist anymore. This should be a warning for us about compromises to be realistic and enforcing them on each other. So, in the front.
It's not about that.
Please, let's move on.
Okay.
The 20th century is over and has taught us many things.
Yeah. Just a question about unions in general. So, like, you referenced, what happened on the West Coast is like this great example of success within Occupy with the port shutdowns. But basically, that was able to happen because the unions that were there had a long history of already being radicalized, right? But then Chicago is like a hugely union-based town, right? And so, if we think about that, though, connecting to what happened in Wisconsin and why that wasn't successful is because they listened to the union leadership. And because the union leadership was not ready to do general strike, they said no, and so it didn't happen. But in Chicago, where we kind of look at Occupy as this breath of fresh air, it's revitalized unions, right? It's radicalized unions. We've seen marches with unions at unprecedented levels. But at the same time, we're still in this struggle. And at the same time, a lot of people in unions, although they're connecting to like the 99.1% rhetoric and they're understanding that their struggles are the same all around, they're having trouble getting to that next radicalized step because they still are kind of stuck within this like top-down structure of organizing where their leadership ultimately kind of limits how they can protest, what they can do days on, days off. Ultimately, oftentimes, if they're still part of the Democratic Party and so on and so forth. So given that like the unions are, as you say, like our best kind of hope and front because they do occupy this fixed space and one of the only ones that are fixed in the capitalist system, like how do you see them really as like being able to move forward and being able to radicalize given that they're still within this very like top-down structure?
No. I mean, I guess I want to respond to the last part of what you said first, which is that yeah, unions occupy some sort of like fixed space, but it's it's like standing on a sinking island.
Yeah.
And I'm not gonna I'm not gonna jump onto the sinking island so that I can sink with them in a like more radical way.
Yeah.
Personally, I don't see unions as like the fixed role where we can gain a foothold and then move forward. That's just a response to the last part of what you said.
I'll try more.
But by the way, I sometimes work at a union workplace. It's not like it's not personal.
No, this is us like trying to figure out what is going to work, right? Yeah. Yeah, we live in a right to work state, if you know what that is.
Yeah.
I got it. What? Not go anyway.
Okay, but go on. Try to respond to it.
Yeah. This is a problem for anybody who believes in capitalism but wants an ethical world, right? They're like, in Wisconsin, they're like, well, sure, we could make another barrier to trade in Wisconsin, but then all the capital will flow out of Wisconsin somewhere else. That wouldn't be an ethical choice either. This is sort of a race to the bottom worldwide. This is the capitalist talking. Yeah. I mean, so I mean, we can imagine even capitalists who wanted to make things better for us would have no idea how to do it. The system can't do that. Optimistically, we could imagine that if it becomes impossible to do what unions have done for the last few generations, that the unions themselves, in order to survive at all, will have to adopt a more radical program. This is unlikely to be led by the union bureaucrats who are there precisely because of being willing to play the game, as opposed to adopting a more radical program or a more confrontational one. I think folks in positions of power in top-down organizations of all kinds have to follow behind really powerful grassroots struggles. Even in 1946, at the peak of union power in North America, the Oakland General Strike was made real by card-carrying union workers who didn't have a meeting about it, who didn't talk to their leadership, who just got off the streetcars as they were going to work, that morning before dawn, when they saw that police were bringing supplies into the department store that was shut down. People who want to see radical union struggles work, I would say, connect with the people at the bottom, do something crazy, and if you can do it big enough, the leadership will have to run along behind you to get your attention so they can call it off. That's as much hope as I see in that space. And it is a space for organizing, but it may not be a space that lends itself as effectively to us gaining momentum as spaces outside, as spaces where the disinherited meet.
Get some other questions.
Yes.
Gosh, all right. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Remember your number.
Be loud, I'm old here.
I'm curious about the origins of your talk of autonomous zones of action. Generally, when I hear other anarchists talking about autonomous zones, I get a little suspicious because I tend to associate that with like Hacking Bay and post-left anarchism, which I generally find kind of obtuse and counterproductive. But I was wondering if you could clarify where that comes from.
We said autonomous sites.
We actually came up with it in a park a couple blocks from here because we were trying to find language to express something we've been throwing around for a while. Yeah, it's not Hacking Bay.
Yeah, I mean, I think it should be clear from what we're talking about that we don't just mean like rave parties. Or Burning Man. There we go.
We don't mean Burning Man.
You know, we might not even mean a Burning Man that spreads. You know? An autonomous site of power is like, if we're all in this room and we're like, you know, okay, we want to bring capitalism to an end. What can we all do with our capabilities right now to, you know, to take a step towards that? You know, and we're all invested in that. We take our potential out of the logic of capitalist exchange and figure out how collectively to do something else with it. You know, like we barricade the doors and call for. They tried to cancel cultural studies here. Is that
yes? They tried, but
Mike check that.
they fucked with the wrong major, basically.
Yes.
Well, you know, we barricade the doors. We consensus on. Maybe we consensus on a demand. Demand is not the center of gravity, is what I'm saying. The center of gravity is the way that we use our potential together, and that we build the capacity to continue doing that more and more powerfully, and in a way that enables others to be in touch with their potential outside the logic of capitalism as well. To try to extemporaneously.
We have a lot of questions.
Yes.
Two. Who's two? I think it's you.
Yeah. So I have general comments just as a person who represents different sides of the world. Yeah, I was just mentioning a little bit. Yeah, I've heard so much optimism, right, about contemporary technologies and how they help us just to make this revolution like international, right? But I'm not in general so optimistic here because, for example, in my country, right, it lives under dictatorship, yes, and we made our own like revolution with the help of internet, like social network revolution, yeah, and it failed because our government it just suppressed all activists and put them in jail, and that's it. So you see, I mean, I'm not so optimistic because I think like technology, internet helps a lot, right? I agree, right? It spreads word across the world, but still, I think it's also. So I mean, to achieve internet justice is much more easier than to achieve justice in a real world, right? Because still many people don't have this access to the technologies like homeless people and I mean and this is sort of a bit much, yeah, but still it's also my criticism towards Occupy movement, right? Because I was here for a while, just like being part of this, right? So I was just speaking like yesterday with one guy from anti-eviction movement at south side of Chicago, right? They occupy this building to defend it against banks, right? And we were speaking about that actually Occupy Chicago, right? It doesn't represent, in certain sense, minorities, right? So I like that they organized the chain to represent some people from Eastern Europe, yeah, because it's important, right? Because neoliberal wants just to make some nation out of trash. But on the other hand, what I observed is, so this guy from South Side of Chicago gave an example, right? That, for example, for African American guy from South of Chicago to come to GA meeting downtown, right? He should take a subway. It's $2 one way and $2 like so. And he could buy a meal, so it's also sort of a privilege to be part of Occupy Chicago. And just from my own perspective, yeah, I saw like some homeless people part of Occupy Chicago. As you said, like middle class bureaucrats of America, yes, they understood that they have something in common with homeless, yes. But still, I mean, the logic of capitalism, right? I saw this logic of capitalism even inside of Chicago when these middle class people, when they started to say that like it's anti-capitalistic movement, they said no, it's not anti-capitalistic. When I said about the representation of some minorities like African American homeless or even Eastern European people, they told like we're not homeless, right? We are middle class, and I didn't see homeless people. They were part of GA, but I didn't see their big involvement, their representation. in public space. So yeah, just my yeah. Sorry, that was so long.
Well, I mean, that like what I got from that was two different things. One is the like these sort of like bids to be the face of the Occupy movement, you know, which aren't just like, you know, things on the media. They're actually things in practice too, like where the occupation is located, people's ability to get to it, you know, people's quality of life once they're there. Those aspects. And then there's this other thing about technology and the role it plays in social struggles today. And I want to comment on that second one, and then I don't know if you have something to say on that.
No, my point I will verify about technology is we shouldn't overestimate the power of technology.
Absolutely.
Because still many people don't have access to like, I don't know, to like camera or something else.
Yeah. Well, gosh, I mean, I'm not optimistic that the communication technology is going to like make this shit easier than it has been for the last like
Twitter,
1,000 years.
I mean, Twitter used those things that happened in Tunisia and Egypt as an advertisement for itself.
Right.
But Twitter also turns over information, you know, data mining about all of the communications that go through Twitter to just about everybody.
So that's the point that I want to make is that you know, we don't have to like divide it to pro Twitter camps and anti-Twitter camps. We do have to recognize that those are a very real part of how struggles flare up in the country, in the today. Okay, but the important thing to get from that is that all of these communication technologies right now are sort of an uncharted territory. You know, they're uncontrolled in some ways, and for that reason, the people in power are trying very hard right now to clamp down on them. You know, that the repression we're seeing in the wake of 2011's like wave of struggle globally, a lot of that repression is happening through these same social media. You know, going through all the Twitter feeds, trying to identify people from that technology.
Yeah.
Right. And so what I want to say about that is that we're going to see more of these efforts at controlling the space of communication in the coming years, and those aren't just going to be battles about like free speech or something. Those are actually going to be battles that determine some of our ability to coordinate revolt in the coming years. Now, it's true that not everybody has access to these means of technology, but you know, that's just another way of controlling the space, is controlling access to the technological means of it. Did you have anything to say about the first part of that, and then we can move on to these other questions?
I would just summarize about technology. In a world generated by capitalism, there isn't much for us to work with to fight it except that which it makes. But we can only, and we can fight it with those things, but only by not using them uncritically, only by not using them for what they're for. And whenever we generate a new strategy with one of these tools, the tool will again be reabsorbed into the functioning, and we have to come up with another way to challenge all of these things that are given to us.
All right, I think you and then you.
Yeah. How do you make connections with other groups and other communities when those communities and groups might be kind of more tied in with the kind of institutions that have traditionally served as pressure valves for revolution and turning it into reform, whether it's the church, the labor movement, or the Democratic Party? I'm not talking about connections with those actual institutions, but with people where, you know, they're kind of embedded in that and won't want to leave that behind.
Can I do? Yeah. Okay. So I live in this neighborhood that's being gentrified. There's an influential church in the neighborhood. A lot of people are involved with, you know, and at first when we were trying to fight the gentrification, you know, specifically the building of this giant condominium, this green condominium, you know, activists went to the pastor at the church, you know, and we're trying to form this sort of this coalition, you know, with anti-gentrification activists, you know, the leadership of the church. And then, you know, the leadership of the church actually, those folks had the least reason to piss off these developers who were coming in, because they know they're going to have a relationship with them for a long time. And so for a while, like, folks were dispirited. We were just like, oh, nobody wants to fight the gentrification. You know, finally, you know, this document, you know, calling on people not to buy condominiums that had been blocked by the leadership of this coalition. Folks just took the document and walked around door to door to everybody who lived in the neighborhood. Everybody signed the document. The way to do it is just by connecting with people directly, not about the party politics, not about forming coalitions from the top down, but about people's immediate needs, in a direct way. That's one little example, but that's the best I've got.
Yeah, so in this sense, technologies can help to connect people directly, right?
So, say again?
So in this sense, technologies are helpful, right? Because they will help to connect immediately, right?
Well, the way that the leadership mediates our interactions with each other can put a cap on our potential. Did you have a?
Yes. So first I just want to comment to the comment of the fact that it does take a long time to get from the South Side, because I live on the South Side. It does take a long time, but I think it's a disservice to ignore the fact that there is an Occupy the South Side. I think it's a disservice to actually the creative forces that are in Chicago right now, the neighborhood occupations, which I think are like the most beautiful aspect of what we have going on right now in Chicago. So just to put that out there, because I think it's quite well taken. My question is, I agree with your sort of skepticism of the strike and the efficacy of the strike. And I wonder if you could speak to the potential of a mass debt default. How that might happen, what that might do.
We talked some about this last night.
Yeah, somebody brought it up last night. People are pumped about this. And that's the first step. Okay, yeah. Raise your hand if you know about the poll tax protests in England. Okay, several of you. To give a brief rundown of it, and this is sort of an example of what I imagine we could do something like, right? In England, at the end of the Thatcher era, the Tory murderers introduced this new tax that was just like a flat tax on everybody, and the protest movement against this took two forms. One was non-payment of the tax, where people individually refused to pay the tax, and then neighborhood coalitions formed to defend anybody who was targeted for not paying the tax. And then the second side of it was public demonstrations, which became increasingly fierce all around different parts of England, culminating in London, I don't remember the date, 1990, early 1990, I believe, with tremendous riots that decimated the financial district and ultimately brought down the Tory leadership of the British government and brought an end to that era. This would take a lot of organizing, but the really promising thing about this is it's not just a matter of trying to get leverage on our leaders to be nice to us, by like begging them for something. If we all cease to pay, which we can all see what we have to gain from that, and we're all just waiting for each other. Everybody would do it if everybody else would do it, It's just a question of how to get that started. But yes, I think that has a lot of promise.
Let me say something about that real quickly, because one of the first things you said is really important, which is that it wasn't just people organizing to not pay the tax. It was also organizing to defend anybody that came under fire for not paying the tax. And maybe at the end of the 80s, like if you didn't pay your taxes in the neighborhood, Margaret Thatcher came to your neighborhood with some police and like tried to drag you out of your house, and you could throw bricks at her. If you don't pay your debts in the United States, they take you to court and they garnish your wages. Right? It's a little bit different. It's pretty hard to organize neighborhood defense against garnishing wages. What that means to me is that sort of like mass debt default, it has to happen in a context where we are able to defend ourselves, we are able to meet our own needs, and we're actively building that capability. And so it all comes back to these sites of power that we were talking about. Either sites of power that will make it possible for us not to have to work at jobs where our wages can be garnished, or that will make it possible for us to meet our needs in some other way.
This is sometimes people use the word commons, but certainly collectively meeting our needs.
Right, but the central thing about that is that a mass debt strike for me can't just be a political movement,
right?
Like an abstract political movement that leaves everybody as individuals at home just not paying debts.
We have maybe 20 minutes more technically for this, so we'll try to take the last few comments. But I would really like for people to stick around here.
Yeah.
If you see somebody here that you don't know, or somebody who said something interesting, or just someone that you don't know, if we all stick around here afterwards and have conversations, that's going to be so much more powerful than us running our mouths. So, who is the next person who had their hand up?
It was someone more towards the back, but I don't remember.
Well, this person.
Okay, I was sick, but I guess it's fine behind here. I recently read an article about how they were comparing prisons and how they're kind of the new like Jim Crow laws. Just because in Texas there's laws that if you're incarcerated you're not allowed to vote. And so my question is kind of like, I want to get your opinion on how prisons kind of demean the person like as a human being and how it allows them to function in society and where that kind of ties in with like capitalism.
Prisons are terrible. Some of my friends are in prison. Burn them to the ground once everybody's out. I don't know.
I guess like another part is like you also talk about how revolution is easier than reform. And I guess that would apply to prisons better because it would be so hard to like reform them in a way that would allow people to function better in society. Instead, you just kind of have to burn them down and just, like you said.
There's an interesting thing about this actually. With there are many groups now trying to solve the prison problem in the United States. You know, there are a lot of people in prison. That's costing the government a lot of money, and at the same time, it's terrible for people. It doesn't help in a lot of different ways. And other people can speak to that more effectively than I can. But this poses another question. What does it look like? Could we abolish prison in a capitalist society? You know, I mean, there would have to be a mechanism, like Andrew was talking about, to punish people directly without even having to incarcerate them. You know,
I mean, we could all be wearing like electronic shock collars.
Right. Whenever we do something bad, we're electrified. You know, that would be a way to abolish prison.
Yeah,
and it
solves the prison problem.
Liberals would love that, in fact, right? Because then people would just not do bad things, but at the same time, there wouldn't have to be prisons, and nobody would have to be locked up. So,
you know, someone who is proposed that he did is anyone have a gun, so he can just defend himself. So if there will be no prisons, everyone should have a gun and just to defend himself.
What this brings out for me is the importance of really revolutionary solutions, rather than even ambitious reforms to this system that maintain its logic.
Hey, really quick, actually, we can go past 9, but just for the sake to everyone have a voice here, keep your questions, like, say, under 2 minutes, just so everyone has a chance to say what they want to say.
Okay, so there are 3 hands up now. I think you in the denim jacket had your hand up before me. No, I'm wrong. Okay. Did you?
Let's take a few more and then wait for individuals.
All right, let's do these 3, and then let's just have some informal conversations because they're more interesting. 1, 2, 3.
I'm afraid that I probably won't sound as friendly as the rest of the people here, but I really did appreciate the presentation. I really did. But first, I don't think it's going to take electric shocks that are going to end the prison system. I think ending racism will abolish the actual prison system, and we have to be very clear about that. And I wanted to say that the IWW, as an organization, was a byproduct of people actually questioning capitalism for the first time. So we have to be very careful as revolutionaries that we're not pitting organized labor against unorganized labor, because there's actually tons of people radicalizing right now who don't have that rich history of organized labor. So we have to be very careful about that. And I also wanted to say your dismissal of the Bolshevik Revolution I have questions about, because I mean there's a rich history there. Whether or not you agree, there's a rich history there, including the decriminalization of homosexuality and ending women's oppression. I mean that's a rich history so to skip over that is worrisome. And I just wanted to say that you know, that it's a disservice to radicalizing elements to not pass on this history. And that my question, I guess, and I just wanted to lastly say, is that you know you're protected as a worker in this country if you have a common issue with one more person in your workplace. It's called concerted activity. It's protected by the National Labor Bureau. So that's a right that you have to form a union. So I just wanted to ask you. My question is, what is more revolutionary about a black bloc versus like actually occupying capital?
Occupying
capital, yeah. Like what if you had to say like why is one more revolutionary than the other?
Neither one of those is intrinsically more revolutionary.
If there's anything promising about Either it would be the way that they create the potential for us to autonomously develop our collective power rather than to make demands of our rulers.
I mean, there's all kinds of things you can do in a Capitol building other than leave it.
It's not like comparing the tracks, it's recognizing that they're both going to take us forward, or is one better than the other? That's
I just said neither one of those is intrinsically more revolutionary. You know?
But what we're proposing is a way to gauge what's worthwhile about a way of acting. You know, and I want to just emphasize one more thing, since the Bolsheviks came up again. You know, the thing that's dangerous about reform is that it can break up a social body that was willing to fight in solidarity for everyone's benefit into a group that has their demands granted and then another group that is targeted. And if we win reforms, the dark side of every reform is the outgroup that is then crushed. And in fact, with the overthrow of Mubarak, the people who are still in the streets in Egypt, the people who took the streets again in December, you know, were being shot with less consequences by the military dictatorship because of the gains that they had won. You know, we should be careful not to ask for things that can be granted without the abolition of capitalism, because the outgroups will be targeted then without anyone caring. There were a lot of people suffering before other people joined them in 2008 in being downwardly mobile. And we shouldn't set up a situation in which a few people can be marginalized and they're suffering again. We should figure out how to fundamentally transform the world.
The last thing I want to say is, I don't think we stood up here and did any cheerleading for organized labor, but if we did, I retract it. That's not our program.
No, I know that's not your program, but I guess I'm coming from a good place, I swear. I think that, you know, you guys traveling and stuff, that there's a lot of people out there who don't have the rich history of studying organized labor. So, I mean, at least you guys know what's actually taking place in history, where there's a lot of newer people to social movements that, for you to just say that organized labor is, like, okay, when you said sink or swim, and you gave that analogy of sink or swim, it should be about solidarity. It shouldn't be about watching your comrades sink. That's what I didn't understand. It was...
Oh, no, we're not talking about anybody sinking. We don't want to sink anybody.
I don't want anybody on sinking ship.
Yeah.
You know, I want to overthrow capitalism. You know, and then we're not going to have to worry about
capitalism.
The decline of the labor unions. Yeah. We should take a couple more questions and then break up. There and then last one over there.
I had a question about, I guess, like health in general. When you guys moved on to the section talking about revolt and things like autonomous sites of power, which is a phrase that I very much liked. I always think about, I guess ever since occupiers started going to the hospital because of exhaustion, just the presence that revolution has to have in your everyday life to maintain health, which I think is another means of maintaining solidarity, but that's also something that you follow home. So what do you guys think about supporting the individuals that are also involved in the like collective struggle on a more, you know, I guess in those like personal places where you need to eat 3 meals every day and try and maintain your health in order to have a sanctity amongst like the creative force of a revolution that's going to need to pace itself, obviously. Like how can we support that? How can we facilitate that as a group, which is going to mean like probably extending a lot of courtesies to people personally that you're going to have to trust with, like, yeah, end of question.
Well, this might be a little bit more of an abstract answer than you want, and maybe we can get into details, but the first thing I would say about that is that the health that's important in a revolutionary movement is not an individual thing. I'm going to make sure that I am a healthy person. I'm going to like eat the right raw foods to make sure that that happens. Nothing against people that eat raw foods. You know, it's a collective thing, right? Health means taking care of each other. Right? And so, for me, when I talk about collective power, I'm not talking about some giant mass movement in the street. Sometimes I'm talking about that, but collective power can be on a much smaller scale, and I think that speaks to the sort of things that you're talking about. Yeah, that's just sort of a generic comment, but one that I really want emphasized.
In a time when people can't meet their needs through the capitalist channels, people will flow into any space in which we're able to meet our needs collectively by other means. You know? That's why people flowed into the occupations, for one of the reasons. You know? That's what will have to be present in any meaningful revolt against debt, in any meaningful revolt against the immiseration of our lives. As Andrew said, that doesn't have to just look like healthcare not moms organizations. It can take place on a smaller level too. You know, my friends who, I teased herbalists earlier in the discussion, but I don't mean to say that herbalism is not a fundamental part of the revolutionary struggle, and that the extent to which we're able to meet our needs in the process of struggle will determine how far we can go. You know, that's the truth. And there's all this pressure on us to treat ourselves like machines and not think we ever have to sleep and so on. And yeah, I mean, we have to take care of each other. If we were going to look back in history for examples, concrete examples, you could maybe look at the Jane Network, you know, that operated in Chicago up until 1973, providing like abortion options for people when that was illegal, you know, as an example of how people can self-organize outside the logic of capitalism and patriarchy to meet their needs.
All right, there was one more question in the back, and I think we were going to break up for some conversations.
Okay. Well, first I have a comment about prison reform.
Can you be loud? I'm sorry.
First, I have a comment about the prison reform system. The way I see the electric shock collar on a person to tell them, hey, don't do this because it's wrong, I see that kind of as like a Clockwork Orange kind of ideal, where you're brainwashed into not doing anything violent because it's what society didn't want him to do. So it kind of takes away the free will of the person if you shock them into not doing anything wrong again. That's the way I see it.
We're not endorsing that, to be honest.
The second one was, how do you see a day in the life after capitalism? Let's say capitalism is completely abolished. How do you see a day in the life?
Oh, you know, we're going to sit on pillows, writing poetry.
We may not live to see that. For me, the purpose of such utopias is to enable us to act in the present. Clifford Harper, this radical designer, anarchist designer, said, utopia is a tool for the education of desire. We can't actually know the future, and constructed by this system as we are, we're not qualified to dream of the kind of future we would choose if we hadn't come out of this system. What these utopias can do is help us to orient ourselves as we act, you know? The moment in which my friend is in trouble and I do something for him or her, not expecting any return on it except the collectivity that we're making, that is a moment, an anti-capitalist moment, if not a moment outside capitalism. And that is a microcosm of the utopia that we may not live to see, but that struggling for is what makes my life worthwhile, what makes it feel meaningful.
I have sort of a concluding remark. Just because we can sit around in lecture halls all day long, talk about ideas, and leave with a lot of great ideas, and do nothing. And so that's the last thing that I want to address. Somebody last night at our event asked us what time scale we saw, you know, the revolution happen. Right? Is it going to come in 10 years or 20 years or in our lifetimes or tomorrow? Or tomorrow or rent comes due again. And you know, it's a misleading question, but it's an important question. And I just want to tell you all the same answer that I told him, which is we live in a time of upheaval right now. That's a fact. You know, we live in a time of crisis, and I don't anticipate that getting patched up together in the next year, or in the next 10 years, in the next 20 years. And what that means is that people are going to be out in the streets, and that there are going to be people out there offering all kinds of false solutions for, you know, the way to solve it all. And some of those are actually kind of scary. You know? What that means to me is that if we have a liberatory vision of a better world, we sure as hell better be in the front lines of upheaval. You know, because if we're not, somebody else is going to be. And as far as the time scale that we see this on, you know, maybe it's 10 years, maybe it's 200 years, maybe it's tomorrow. The important thing is that what happens in the coming decades is very largely going to be determined by what we do now. What we do this year, you know, what we do this month, all right? Sometimes maybe aren't times like that, but now is one. So I just want to emphasize, if you take away one thing from our talk tonight, it's that we need to take ourselves seriously. We need to take ourselves seriously now before it's too late. Do you have anything else you want to add?
Just want to say thanks everybody so much for wanting to have this conversation with us. Like I said, let's stick around and talk to each other in smaller groups. We brought a lot of literature to give away and a little bit that we have to sell. And finally, this is going to be a focal point of a lot of activity and maybe confrontations in the next few months. Good luck to everybody here. And thanks for what you're doing.